delegation teams from U of H. If anybody's interested in participating, go down to Howard University, and it's the mock debate program. Please see Mr. Easterland. Paul, if you raise your hand, I can see who you are. All right, we'll cover your airfare and 2 nights lodging and ground.
It's at Howard?
It's going to be at Howard University.
When is it? When is it?
You graduate. You ain't eligible. And Dr. Beatty is an associate professor of Africana Studies and chair of the Department of Africana Studies at Chicago State. Just briefly, Dr. Beatty received his bachelor's degree in Black World Studies from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And from Miami University, he received his master's degree in Black Studies from the Ohio State University.
They always stress that article.
The Ohio State University. And then we're very proud to say that he received his doctorate degree in African American Studies from Temple University. And so Dr. Beatty is going to speak on reflections of Cheikh Anta Diop and historical perspectives on the African foundation of Egyptian civilization. And why don't we go ahead and get started? And then if you have questions, we'll go into the Q&A period for Dr. Beatty, and we'll take questions from you, and then we'll conclude from there. And then at the end of the class, I'll again give out the exam. Right? So Dr. Beatty, if you want to go ahead and start.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Conyers. Thank you for inviting me here. We're ready? Okay. Thank you for inviting me here to speak to you all today on a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. This is a topic on the work of Cheikh Anta Diop. Before I get started with my talk, I'll say a little bit more about this at the end, but there are still many African scholars that are continuing the work of Cheikh Anta Diop in a very meticulous and systematic fashion. Our collective work in the African world comes out in this journal. So I'm going to circulate this around to let you see some of what we do to compare Egypt to other African civilizations on a very technical level. So these are scholars that I work with closely that are at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, that are in the Congo, the Cameroon, that are in Paris, even that are in various locales in the Caribbean. So this is a very high quality journal that my dissertation advisor and Cheikh Anta Diop's colleague, Théophile Obenga, puts out, that comes out of Paris. So I'll kind of circulate that around and let you see that. What I want to do today, before I get to the PowerPoint presentation, I want to kind of give a more technical opening on Cheikh Anta Diop and kind of read some of my prepared comments here, and then I want to get into the PowerPoint presentation because my prepared remarks are framed in a way where I think that you're going to get a lot from them, and it's not, kind of cookie cutter. This is from an outgrowth of a lot of conversations with Théophile Obenga and learning about Cheikh Anta Diop in a kind of different way. So I want to try to make it as simple as possible, although the issues involved are very complex. Okay, the work that Cheikh Anta Diop, the great Senegalese-born scholar, left for future African generations provided us with both a colossal body of work and a new methodological framework for interpreting African civilizations. In order to chart this new path, Cheikh Anta Diop had to create what Théophile Obenga called an epistemological rupture from the interpretations of European scholars on the African past in order to combat what Diop referred to as the modern falsification of history, in order to establish and open the intellectual space for the realization of an independent and innovative research paradigm produced by African scholars. In approaching the important questions surrounding the African foundation of Egyptian civilization, there have been a complex variety of perspectives and methods used to provide analysis on the questions of ethnicity and the meaning of formative Egyptian cultural features. This presentation seeks to concisely review and present the core thesis and method of the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, and by way of comparison, present and assess some of the major past and present models used to explain and debate the African foundation of Egyptian civilization. I will conclude by providing a few excerpts from recent Egyptological publications that continue to highlight not only the continuing diversity of perspectives, but also the influence of the work of Cheikh Anta Diop in shifting the debate and inspiring some of the recent Egyptological scholarship to fundamentally reassess and depart from past explanatory models that were steeped in racism. Cheikh Anta Diop's work was in part motivated by the imperative to restore the historical consciousness and confidence of African people facing European colonial domination. Diop said that, quote, "The role of history in the existence of a people is vital. History is one of the factors that undergirds the cohesion of different elements of a collective. Without historical consciousness, people are not able to be called to their grand destiny," unquote. There is no people without a history. The knowledge of the past is the first condition of the realization of historical consciousness. For Diop, both individual and collective memory needed a point of departure to understand the present. Diop stressed the need for African people to research lost time, that is, the ancient African past, in a quest to systematically chart the history of African people from prehistory up until modern times. The foundation of Egyptian civilization was an important marker of African cultural continuity and identity to understand in this process. In his work, Diop observed that science was made a fraudulent accomplice to ideology in reproducing schemes always camouflaged by the pretense of high scholarship and erudition. Diop critiqued the pseudoscience which initiated a particular ideological discourse that justified a priori a white supremacist social, moral, religious, and political order. Colonial historiography represented the conscious will of imperial powers to justify colonial practices and to instill cultural alienation as an arm of domination. Diop said that all scientific theories of the African past were utilitarian and pragmatic in nature. That is, they were formed to make the African believe that he had no past and was responsible for nothing valuable, and as a result, the African consequently abandons all aspirations for intellectual and political independence and reinforces his own oppression and subordination in thought and practice. In the Western-inspired school of Africanist scholarship, Diop observed that scholarship on Africa was produced and oriented to serve the historical consciousness of the West, and that it saw Africa like a museum, a primitive image frozen in time that permitted the West to measure how far they had traveled from this primitive moment of civilization. And it permitted them to be proud and convinced that the creation of the values, instruments, and tools of European life were universally superior, and that they were called to the divine task of naturally dominating the world. Western interpretations diluted the historical consciousness of African people and fortified the West, consequently. They did this by teaching Africans that, 1, African people always have been outside of historical movement. 2, African people were cursed and damned. 3, African people have always been predestined to have tutors. 4, African people have invented nothing in history. 5, African people have contributed nothing to humanity, which is why the West assigned itself the noble task of a civilizing mission in Africa. All science, natural and social, is grounded in a systematic analysis of an object and characterized by a particular method utilized to approach this object. In his approach to African civilizations, Diop criticized the intellectual reflex of Africanists to, in terms of space, describe African cultures as disconnected heterogeneous units without any organic bond between them. This led to an anarchic dispersion of tribes. In terms of time, African cultures were viewed as lacking any historical bond. In approaching African realities, Diop said, the scientific interest of the European scholar with regard to African data is essentially analytical. Seeing things from the outside, often reluctant to synthesize, the European clings basically to explosive, more or less biased microanalysis of the facts and constantly postpones ad infinitum the stage of synthesis. The African scholar distrusts this scientific activity, the aim of which seems to be the fragmentation of the collective historical African consciousness into minute facts and details. So in terms of Diop's epistemology of building and forging a new type of African science, Diop institutes this idea of historical continuity. And this idea allows Diop to investigate new types of research questions. And it allowed him to ask and to try to demonstrate the genetic common parent, that is the non-accidental relationship of black African civilizations. A comparison between so-called sub-Saharan and Egyptian and Ethiopian civilizations. This new approach allowed Cheikh Anta Diop the power and the impetus to assert the affirmation and the demonstration of a cultural unity of Africa. In this, Cheikh Anta Diop tried to provide us with pioneering operational concepts that would help us to better explain the African terrain. Diop does not ignore the existence of a diversity of forms of cultural expression on the continent. He tries to transcend this empirical diversity to attain the deep cultural substratum common to African peoples. He sought to demonstrate this by scientific research, in particular through comparative and historical linguistics. The object of study for Diop was not the isolated African tribe of Africanus, but was the black African world in its total spatial temporal totality. And in this work, when we talk about Egypt and the foundations of Egyptian civilization, the question becomes, well, how was this civilization founded? There are some things that we can say. We can say that all across the Nile Valley at that time were a dispersion of kind of local autonomous villages and communities. Each of these communities coalesce behind a common principle that ripples throughout African civilizations, of sacred chiefdoms, of sacred kingdoms, of sacred kings, eventually for more kind of organized and more elaborate states. But over time, these smaller composite social units come together in new types of collectives. So in the Nile Valley, each local community, and this is what something Cheikh Anta Diop said, each local community had its own, what was called totem, its own symbol, that marked its own, kind of local divinity, if you will. And it goes throughout the Nile Valley. There emerges in Egypt larger centers, larger composite social units. These larger composite social units are Abydos, Nakada, Hierakonpolis, primarily. Edfu in Upper Egypt. These are the chiefdoms that a lot of the major development in the foundation of Egyptian civilization centers around. At some point in Upper Egypt, there is the creation of what I will call kind of an Upper Egyptian commonwealth. That means that these are larger villages that are coming together for a common purpose. The cultural unity between these units was pre-existent. It had already been there. But we're talking about different types of union. I want you to think about unity in a lot of different complex ways. Okay, I want you to think about unity in terms of economics. I want you to think about unity in terms of the social relationships, in terms of the cultural features that you see. I want you to think about unity in military terms. And eventually, I want you to think about unity in terms of what Egypt represents at its critical foundation, which is the political union. Okay, that is really what Egypt is, meaning that you have all sorts of different types of cultural unity throughout the Nile Valley. But in Upper Egypt, you have, along with that union, you have these clusters of communities in Upper Egypt coming together to form a commonwealth. And after those units bond, Then they begin to expand. Okay, and they begin to expand and incorporate other parts of the Nile Valley. So they were successful. You know, this often isn't said before. You know, they were successful in overwhelming the Africans in the Delta region, in Lower Egypt. And this successful union is what is called the uniting of the two lands, or the Sema Tawi. Egypt attempted to expand southward, further into Upper Egypt, meaning that once these Upper Egyptians came together to form their own unit, they wanted to expand southward also. What's south of Egypt is what is referred to in the archaeological literature as Nubia, or as A group Nubia. Okay, A group Nubia is a period, it's a term that George Reisner created. It's at Harvard University. A group Nubia is a period of time that is really bounded by about 3100 to 2800 BC. This is a period in Nubia that is concurrent with the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. There's a lot of work done on this, but what I want to suggest to you today is that really A group Nubia is, in nominal terms, is almost a myth, because their culture on the ground, in terms of what we know in archaeology, is almost exactly the same as what you would find in Upper Egypt in Naqada. It's the same pottery, you know, it's the same type of motifs in terms of chieftainships, you know, it's the same type of building, it's the same type of burials. There are many, many similarities. But the separation is that Egypt was not able to successfully militarily overwhelm the peoples to the south. They were able, and they're closer to Nubia. The culture of Nubia, what is called A group Nubia, is closer to Upper Egypt than the cultures that are in the Nile Delta region. Buto, Merimda, Ben Salah, etc. Closer in the archaeological record. But because Egypt was able to overwhelm those people, those Africans militarily, they become part of the union of the two lands. Egypt was not successful in overwhelming the other African cultures to the south. But they were after a period of 300 years or so. And this is why you have a large expanse of time in Nubia where there seems to not be anything of evidence in the archaeological record for a long time, for at least 500 years after 2800 BC. But in terms of the complexity of how Egypt is formed, it's formed with this principle of a divine king. 1,300 miles, perhaps from about Washington, D.C. to Tampa, Florida on the coast, very long stretch of land. But when you form something that's complex, then you begin to have different types of powers that are greater. A power to smite enemies, exact tribute, control information, draft soldiers, regulate manpower and labor, regulate trade, regulate commerce among the Nile Valley. You can do many things when you are united. Okay, and Egypt certainly represents this in its beginnings. Well, Cheikh Anta Diop's approach to this question and his approach to analyzing the African essence of the beginning of Egyptian civilization is that the evidence of Egypt as a black African civilization was, well, one, the Egyptians perceived and represented themselves as black African, not just in terms of art, not just in terms of motifs, but also in terms of the names that they called themselves, Kemet or Kemetiu. Testimony of Greco-Latin sources, testimony of the Bible, the critique of scholarship and physical anthropology, blurring the black affiliation of skeletons and mummies. These are things that Cheikh Anta Diop dealt with in the famous 1974 conference in Cairo. But there are some other things that I want to highlight that weren't necessarily part of that conversation in Cairo. This piece right here that Cheikh Anta Diop focuses on. Major cultural features: totemism, social and political structure, circumcision, cosmogony, divine kingship found among other black African populations up until modern times. Cheikh Anta Diop's whole work, even in his dissertation, his whole work that he got at the Sorbonne, is a comparative analysis of political and social systems emanating in Africa compared to those in Europe. He compared domains of patriarchy and matriarchy. His whole work is about this comparative analysis. Whether it's linguistics, whether it's social structure, whether it's political structure, it doesn't matter. But in terms of Africa, Cheikh Anta Diop is asking a question that really no scholar had asked before that, because the lens of the Western scholarship in reference to Egypt, of course, their eyes were always either on some amorphous categorization of Mediterranean, or it was to the Near East as the source of the beginnings of Egyptian civilization. Cheikh Anta Diop is asking a different series of questions. And he is saying simply is that if you see so many cultural features among African populations that are the same at its most fundamental level, how do you explain that? What is your explanatory model? Is it just coincidence? Or is there some other type of deep relationship between those people that we need new types of explanatory models to reveal that essence? Cheikh Anta Diop also asserted the origin of Egyptian civilization lay in southern Egypt and to the south of Egypt. He submitted a lot of technical arguments on this, even in terms of how the kings referred to themselves, etc. Cheikh Anta Diop also asserted that Nubia and the Sudan was the crossroads between southern Africa, the zone of the Great Lakes, Central Africa, Western Africa, and the surrounding Mediterranean and Arabian region. And it constituted the cradle of civilization, which radiated by Egypt through the entire Africa, the northern Mediterranean, and the Asiatic Near East. So Cheikh Anta Diop's, most scholars would categorize Cheikh Anta Diop's work as diffusion, but not diffusion for diffusion's sake. Cheikh Anta Diop felt that this diffusion, the catalyst for this diffusion, was essentially like primarily invasions and moments of instability, okay, in places that kind of spur populations to migrate and to move. This was kind of his theory of the formation of African states. And he asserted that this explains a large part of this unity. Evidence in Egyptian contributions to Greco-Latin, Canaanite, and Arabic civilizations, So Cheikh Anta Diop is not only concerned with what's going on inside Africa, but also what's going on outside of Africa. In terms of his comparative method, he wanted to utilize all human and exact sciences that could clarify the debate. This is the other unique feature of Cheikh Anta Diop, meaning that it wasn't just anthropology, it wasn't just chemistry, sociology, philosophy, linguistics, Egyptology alone, but was all of them combined together to bring to bear on this one thesis. That's what separates Cheikh Anta Diop out from prior treatments of this question, and his attempt to systematically compare Egypt to other African civilizations. The major geographical areas of this debate are El Badari, 4400 to 4000 BC. Some Egyptologists seem to think that this could, that the Badarians could stretch back at least until 5000 BC from what they have found. But those are the conservative estimates given now. The Nakada region, which was a term created by William Flinders Petrie, who was a very famous Egyptian or British archaeologist doing work in Egypt, a very famous racist also, because he was an avid follower of the eugenics movement. And if everyone knows what the eugenics movement is, it's shaping human beings for future destinies based on race. So he's an avid follower of that, and primarily based on pottery finds. He asserts that there is this kind of one family, this Nakada family, that's very powerful. But prior treatments, revised treatments of him, have subdivided that region of Nakada into different periods of time that stretch from 4000 to 3200 BC. Werner Kaiser, who was a German Egyptologist, has separated them. This is pretty much what Egyptologists follow today, these three phases, and they even further subdivide these phases. Hierakonpolis and A Group Nubia. So these are the territories that provide the most grounds for this debate on the African foundation of Egyptian civilization. what are some of the major models used to explain the foundation of Egyptian civilization? This first model, there are many complexities to this question, so I just want to only give you, kind of a few very important models. This first model comes from Émile Amélinot, Nouvelles Fouilles d'Abydos, New Finds in Abydos. Émile Amélinot is a French archaeologist. Cheikh Anta Diop deals with him a lot in his work. This is why I put him first, because his thesis was that the first black race to occupy Egypt was by the name Anu, founded cities of Esna, Ermont, Kush, and Heliopolis. Well, when people read this, the question is asked, where does the term Anu come from? This is my nephew here. Yeah.
You got it?
Yeah. All right. This is my nephew here, Howie. So he lives in Houston. This first black race of Anu that Émile Amélinot talks about, this name, what you have to know and realize is that the term Anu is created from this toponym. This term Anu is a part of each one of the names of these places. And this was why Amélinot thought that there was one group of people that had to have founded all of these different places. Cheikh Anta Diop took this thesis in his work on African origin of civilization. Okay, so he pretty much accepted this thesis by Amélinot on the Anu, and what Cheikh Anta Diop did was he took one part of the thesis, but he didn't take the second part of the thesis, which was the more racist part. Okay, so in addition to that, Amélinot suggested that there was a coarse white race coming up from the south of Egypt that overwhelmed this Anu people to found Egyptian civilization. So you get a lot of that in terms of the model, the explanatory models used to explain the foundation of Egyptian civilization. This next model that I want to explain is by Elise Baumgartel. She's now deceased, but she wrote a very famous book called The Cultures of Prehistoric Egypt in 1955. And Elise Baumgartel, her thesis was overwhelming in the field of Egyptology, and it held sway for a very long time. It's really founded on this principle of African migration and Asiatic migration. So her thesis was that the Nakata 1 people, you know that timeline that I told you, Nakata 1, 2, and 3? Her thesis was that the Nakata 1 people were essentially African. And then there was this mysterious overwhelming of this Nakata 1 people by the Nakata 2 people that were Asiatic. And the Nakata 2 people were the people who were overwhelmingly superior in terms of intellect, in terms of trade, in terms of commerce, in terms of building. And it is these people, the Nakata 2 people, that are really responsible for the foundation of Egyptian civilization. Okay, this thesis held for a very long time in the field of Egyptology. This next scholar is William Flinders Petrie, my friend who we just talked about. And Petrie's thesis circulated in many sectors by James Henry Breasted at the Oriental Institute. Many of the most prominent people, George Reisner, many of the early foundational figures of Egyptology doing work held this thesis. And this thesis didn't have anything to do with Africa at all. It was the sense that this overwhelming master race came in from Asia and overwhelmed the indigenous population that was already there and completely founded Egyptian civilization. So there is no need to look to Africa. There is no need to look to other cultures or social and political systems inside the continent. Everything that Egypt is, was, or would be came from outside completely. Okay, that is this thesis. This next model is a more complex model, and this is what I want you to take from this presentation. These are modern models dealing with the foundation of Egyptian civilization that I'm almost sure that you probably are not aware of, okay? Because a lot of it's, in a lot of technical literature that's not popularized, that you can't really purchase in bookstores, but it is out there, okay? This model is what I call the total African indigenous model with reception of outside elements. And simply put, in the past, Egyptologists, if there were outside elements that came into Egypt, they would see that as whole evidence that the spur or the catalyst for Egyptian civilization came from outside. Well, this theory attempts to say that the foundation of Egypt is virtually totally indigenous, and there is only a reception of outside elements, only small elements, commerce and trade. I'll give you an example. One of the major pillars used to suggest ancient Egyptian civilization as being founded or grounded in something else is the agricultural revolution. Okay? And many Egyptologists said that, well, the agricultural revolution took place in Western Asia based upon all the evidence that we have prior to taking place in Egypt. So there had to be a diffusion of this agricultural emphasis into the Nile Valley. From where? We don't know. Perhaps through the Nile Delta, perhaps through the east, through Wadi Hammamat. But regardless of where it came into Egypt at, nevertheless, it was still there. Well, this theory says that, well, perhaps there were elements. Perhaps the idea of agriculture may have come in to Egypt. But the idea did not mean that it shaped their whole subsistence strategy. That means that if you wholesale took something from someone else, you would use the same term. You would use the same language. The idea would not only diffuse, but you would also see it in the language. But all of the terms dealing with agriculture, wheat, barley, the crops that the Egyptians built that are the foundation of their civilization in terms of feeding their population, all of those terms have no similarity with terms in Western Asia. So this theory states that these elements coming in from outside were integrated into ancient Egypt as part of a regular subsistence strategy of the Egyptian population. So there's no need to suggest that a population from outside came in and totally overwhelmed their civilization and brought everything in them. It is simply a matter of borrowing, okay, that goes on all of the time between civilizations. Also, the other big point of emphasis of this is that they are looking to Africa. This theory asks a question, and it says that if you have a civilization like Egypt, where there has been no substantial evidence demonstrated from outside, from the Mediterranean, from Western Asia, there is no substantial evidence demonstrated that Egypt matches up with those civilizations on any level in terms of fundamental cultural, political, and social institutions. That is a fact. If you have that fact laying out there, then it is natural for you to look inside Africa for the foundation of Egyptian civilization in terms of cultural unity. So these scholars, and when I say these scholars are not, I'm purposely mentioning people like Joseph Cervello Ataori, because he's not part of Cheikh Anta Diop's school. This is a major Egyptologist, a white Spaniard from the University of Barcelona at Spain, who is really kind of continuing Cheikh Anta Diop's work, okay, in terms of this. And he wrote his dissertation on pharaonic kingship, comparing it to other African civilizations, because there is no models to compare it to anything else. And this last model, which is a little bit more interesting model that you might see in Borders or Barnes and Nobles. This is from a scholar, Toby Wilkinson, in England. He has a book called Early Dynastic Egypt, which you can get in Borders and Barnes and Nobles, which really is, in English, is probably the most comprehensive synthesis of information on early dynastic Egypt that you'll find in our language. But he attempted to, in this book, Genesis of Egypt, Dramatic New Discoveries Rewrite the Origins of Ancient Egypt, what he attempts to do is to ask a question. He says, he takes it as a given that the foundation of the Egyptian civilization was African, was an African phenomenon. But he asks a further question, well, where does it actually come from? You know, where does this impetus come from? So he did an extensive survey of rock art to the east of Egypt, in the eastern desert. And on that basis, he suggested that perhaps because there has been no burials found in the eastern desert, there has been no settlement communities found in the eastern desert of any communities. Well, on this basis, he implies that there must have been these large communities in the eastern desert. And he suggests, more than suggests, that the eastern desert is the foundation for Egyptian civilization. That's why I put it as the revised total indigenous thesis, because it's a thesis that I don't agree with. Because the thesis prior to that, their thesis is grounded in going the opposite way. You see what I'm saying? Their thesis is grounded in surveying not rock art in the eastern desert, but their thesis is grounded in surveying rock art in the Sahara Desert and in communities to the south. Okay, so we have two things going on, but this right here, what Toby Wilkinson is doing, is subtly trying to open up the possibility, once again, of perhaps Asiatic migration into Egypt from the eastern desert. Although he doesn't overtly come out and say that, that's really the implications of this thesis. So although he accepts it largely as an indigenous African phenomena, there are other things going on there that you have to pay close attention to. Contemporary works. David O'Connor, who is a major Egyptologist at New York University, wrote a book, edited a book called Ancient Egypt in Africa, that you all should be aware of. In this book, what was a catalyst for him to write this book was that he surveyed what was going on in African communities all across the United States. And he says, wherever I turn, these African scholars keep on pushing this issue of Nile Valley civilizations, and they keep on talking about the African origin of Egyptian civilization, and I can't get around them. So what spurred him to write this book was really kind of a response to a lot of the work that African scholars are doing on the continent and in the diaspora on this question. So in writing this question, it's some very interesting things that he says in this book. One of the things that he says is that the Egyptian concept of kingship, so akin to African models, seems very different to that held in the ancient Near East. That's obvious. That's obvious. Secondly, there is a relative abundance of ancient materials relevant to contact and influence, as well as striking correlations between ancient Egyptian civilization and the ethnography of recent and current sub-Saharan communities, chiefdoms, and states. There are considerable theoretical problems in comparing the two, not least those imposed by chronology. This is what you will find as the major difference between Cheikh Anta Diop, between Joseph Altuori, and between these more conservative Egyptologists, is that they see the similarities between Egypt and other African cultures. They cannot get around it. But what they will say in argument is that the problem is chronology. Meaning that what Cheikh Anta Diop attempted to do was, based on this theory of deep cultural unity, it allows Cheikh Anta Diop to compare ancient Egyptian language to Wolof. Contemporary time. Okay, modern period, post-16th century. And Cheikh Anta Diop said, well, if you have, this is the thesis that he presented at UNESCO in Cairo. He says, if you have the whole series of personal pronouns that are the same, exactly the same, in Wolof and Egyptian, how do you explain that fact? How do you explain it? And he gave a lot of other examples in comparing African languages, but the one he focused on was his own, Wolof. So for that, Cheikh Anta Diop saying the time and space was not a barrier to this analysis. And in fact, for Cheikh Anta Diop, it was quite the opposite. It made the link even stronger. Meaning that the greater space and time between these things, it lets you know that these things were perpetuated and continued in a very strong way over a long period of time. But for them, chronology is the smoking gun to be very hesitant in interpreting the data, because they're not willing to try to make that type of synthetical analysis because of the barriers imposed by chronology. It's a very important difference. And you see also in major Egyptologists, you see a lot of the conservative past theories that are still continuing in the field. This is Pascal Vernous and Jean Yoyot. These are people who are at the École des Hautes Études in Paris, the School of Higher Studies. But this is their English book in translation, the Book of the Pharaohs. But essentially what they do is, this is an old warmed over thesis, and the reason why I'm giving these examples is that this book was published in 2000. These are major Egyptologists, who are still doing this. And what they attempt to do in their book is basically, talk about the dolichocephalic Mediterranean, meaning long-headed, kind of the long-headed type, compared to the brachycephalic people, the short skull, short-headed type. And he sees overwhelming in the data of the brachycephalic people over the dolichocephalic people. That's just absurd. Okay, this is what their theory is founded on. It's just exclusively skulls. And it's not even when you look at the skeletal evidence. There is a lot of contemporary data being done on the skeletal evidence of the Egyptian civilization. There is a very famous African American biological anthropologist named Shamarka Keita, who is in DC, who works at Howard University, who is doing a lot of work in this area, looking at the ancient skeletal evidence.